Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, RegisKillbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are my 5 tips for playing Evolve Token Shaman. This has been one of the most popular decks on the ladder in the Journey to Unguro era, and if you're still looking for some tips on how to play this bad boy before we move into the next expansion, this is the video that will help. But frankly, even if you catch this video in the future and maybe this exact version of a deck, Evolve Token Shaman, isn't out there, I think there are still some good general tips here for playing token-style decks that have a similar game plan to what an Evolve Token Shaman deck would play, so you can probably still learn a little bit no matter when you're watching this video. All that said, let's go ahead and jump into my list of tips. My first tip is that you need to identify a plan for the game pretty early on based on both the hand that you have, but also the opponent that you're playing. So basically, within the first turn or two, you're going to have a really good sense of what your hand is capable of doing. And if you see that you have a ton of low-cost minions and you can really swarm the board and quickly develop them with an Evolve to turn them into a nice monster early to mid-game board, that might have to be your game plan. If you look at your hand and it's a little bit more awkward, maybe you have like a Stonehill Defender and a thing from below, and you're parked on a Bloodlust, you'll be able to see really quickly that you're going to have to take the game a little slower. So you can't just trickle out minions one at a time and hope to kind of curve out and do something. You're probably going to have to play for some sort of big swing turn later, saving up some resources, hitting that big Doppelgangster Evolve, landing a high-tempo pair of thing from belows. You'll need some sort of swing turn. And if you really pay attention to what your hand is doing and the kind of ways you can play your hand over the first few turns of a game, based on what appears in your mulligan, then that'll really help you dictate what happens in a game. Instead of just sort of relying on top decks or good luck, you can really have a game plan that you follow to fruition. And that can also, of course, be colored by what your opponent is playing. If they're a control deck, you might have to adjust your game plan versus if they're an aggro deck. They're a really hyper-aggressive deck, you might just have to play out a board as regularly as you can just to get minions out every turn and contest what they're trying to do. Otherwise, you'll just fall too far behind for those swing turns to ever really matter. But it's just important that you pay attention in those early games. You very consciously sit and say to yourself, okay, what are they? What are they trying to do? What resources do I have available and what am I trying to do? And if you sit and you make that plan instead of just sort of playing the first card that comes in your hand and playing the only thing you can play on mana cost, you'll find yourself in a much better spot 2 or 3 turns down the road with actual plans and actual resources to accomplish things that win you the game. My second tip is that you really need to use Evolve around your opponent's likely answers to an evolved board. In other words, you need to pay close attention to the kinds of removal they're likely to have, and make sure that you evolve in a way that probably sets your evolved minions up in a way that counters that removal. So let's say, for instance, you're playing a Token Druid deck against a Token Druid deck, and you know they're not likely to have a lot of small AoE removal. They might have, for instance, like a swipe. But if you can get your minions to higher health totals than 1 health, you get a couple minions to 2, 3, etc., and it's a wide board of 2 and 3 health minions, you know, for instance, Swipe is going to be fairly inefficient against that board, so you can evolve a bunch of small stuff to play around Swipe. But alternatively, if you're playing against a mage, and you know that, for instance, they have a Flame Strike because they're a control mage, putting a bunch of 3 health minions out on the board is not going to accomplish anything, so you shouldn't try to evolve into minions that are on average 3 health, so you know, your 2 drops and maybe even 1 drops, 2 drops, and 3 drops. You might need to instead save your Evolve for a Doppelgangster Evolve turn, because you know Mage will have a more difficult time answering those 5, 6, 7 health minions that you get from Doppelgangster Evolve. Similarly, you probably need to be careful with things like Brawls or total board clear effects, and use your Evolves in ways that don't bait out Brawls too early, and you can actually suss out a Brawl from your opponent and then maybe play your Evolve immediately after that Brawl, so you know that those Evolve stats are more likely to stick instead of get removed in one fell swoop. But ultimately, it's just going to come down to the matchup in your hand. I can't teach you every single instance and iteration of when you should evolve and when you shouldn't. You're just going to have to use your judgment. But as long as you're critically thinking about what your opponent's likely to have, whether it's Volcanic Potion versus Flame Strike, or whether it's Swipe or Brawl, depending on the matchup, whatever it might be, Consecration for Paladins versus True Silver, there's all kinds of things you can evolve around. You just have to be aware of it and make decisions based on what your opponent has, and that'll make sure that your boards are more likely to stick, or at least a couple minions are more likely to stick, allowing you to utilize those Flametongue totems and those Bloodlusts to really develop and utilize the board that you've built in the most favorable ways. Moving on to my third tip, one mistake I've seen a lot of people playing this deck make is that they're just way too greedy with their Evolve and their Bloodlust. They see both Evolve and Bloodlust as sort of these mega win condition cards that you really only play when you know you're either cementing some giant board of Doppelgangster Evolves or you're actually just winning the game via lethal with Bloodlust. But too many people just save them for those really big moments, when a lot of the time you're fine just using your Evolve on a board of 4 or 5 dudes in the early game. Even if they're just 1 mana, 2 mana cards, you can still often evolve those into so many stats and so much mid-game pressure that your opponent simply can't deal with it all, and you just win the game on the back of those small minions. It doesn't always have to be the giant thing from below Doppelgangster Evolve turn. Sometimes a little bit less is actually more, just because it happens earlier in the game. You can have a bigger influence faster. And the same thing can be said with Bloodlust. You don't necessarily have to get lethal with Bloodlust. If you have 4 minions on the board and you're entering the mid-game, there's a chance you'll never have that many minions on the board again, and that's just the best opportunity for you to get max damage out of your Bloodlust. Otherwise, it's just going to be a dead card in your game. So, just play the Bloodlust. Get the 12 damage or whatever extra it might be, hit them in the face, and then rely on refilling your board later. Rely on your Jade Lightnings, rely on your Jade Claws to find the missing pieces of damage later. Now, of course, there are always conditions to that. If you're playing a mage with Ice Block, you might have to think about different things, etc., etc. They have a lot of life gain. You may not want to make those kinds of gambles and plays. But all of that aside, just don't be too greedy. Don't try to do too much with these cards just because they look like big win conditions. They can still be advantageous cards. And on that note, one other thing people don't do enough of is use Bloodlust to trade. Sometimes you can just use your Bloodlust to really efficiently trade up into a board. Often, almost always, this deck will run 2 Bloodlust, so you're not exactly sacrificing your only win condition. Just go for the value off of Bloodlust. Again, it doesn't have to win you the game. It can still accomplish a lot as just a regular old card. Moving on to my fourth tip. This one's a little bit more specific than what you typically see from me in these videos, but after looking at some data on hsreplays.net, which is a great resource for data, by the way, if you're looking for all kinds of information about win percentages and mulligans and matchups and so on and so forth, I certainly recommend you check that out. But one thing I saw when reviewing Evolve Token Shaman in particular is that way too many people keep Stonehill Defender in their mulligan. It's something like 50% of people will keep a Stonehill Defender, but it actually has one of the lowest win rates in the deck for cards in your opening hand. It's just too slow for what the true merits of Evolve Shaman have to offer. And yes, some people would say, oh, but I keep it against Pirates because I know I'm going to need taunts against Pirates. Well, I would argue even in that matchup, you're keeping it too often because hitting those early Fireflies and just getting an aggressive board out there that can trade into the Pirate Warriors is going to give you a better chance at stabilizing and surviving than just trying to hit a really weak on-tempo Stonehill play that's just a 1/4 body that gets shredded, and you get one more taunt that gets shredded and you never actually accomplish anything. So people are keeping Stonehill Defender way too often because it's not actually that good in your opening hand. And on the other side of that, people are mulliganing away Flametongue Totem despite the fact that it's one of the best cards to have in your opening hand. Flametongue Totem is fantastic, guys. People, I think, just see it as a 0/3 and say, oh, it's not developing enough stats on the board on its own right. But the ability it gives you to trade up into so many things when you hit that one drop, if you hit the Firefly, or you hit a Pirate and you get that Patches out there, you just have to coin Totem sometimes if you know you have a follow-up with Flametongue. It can just open up so many doors, allowing you to kill the early Murlocs, allowing you to kill the Innervate Vicious Fledglings of the world. It just allows for so much power. And frankly, it's just a 3 health minion early in the game too, which can be something that just sticks out there and survives and gives your opponents all kinds of fits and forces them to change their style of play because it's such a high friction card because they know how much value it gives. So way too many people are getting rid of Flametongue in that opening hand. you should often keep it. In fact, almost always probably keep it as long as you have some sort of other 1 or 2 mana play that you know you're going to have a way to utilize your Flametongue early in the game. And frankly, you don't even necessarily need a card because your hero power is always there to summon dudes too. So just a little bit of mulligan advice there. I think some people are getting wrong, but can have a really big influence on your overall win rate with this deck. And then my 5th and final tip is to find balance when building your board. And this actually means a couple of different things. Number 1, you really need to find a balance with the kind of minions that are on your board. And when I say kind, I don't mean like elemental versus totem. What I mean are minions that do different things or serve different purposes. In other words, you have some minions like Firefly, for instance, which is just a body, sort of a base builder minion. It's just there to build upon. And then you have other minions like Flametongue Totem, which are there to capitalize on minions, right? So you need to find a balance. You don't want to put all of your high power capitalization minions out there at once. You don't want a board full of Flametongue Totems and Manatide Totems necessarily. You want to sometimes split your resources so that if they do clear your board, if they have an answer, you didn't use all of your most powerful cards at once and lose them all simultaneously. You basically split your resources a little bit, so some of your weaker cards, some of your stronger cards got removed, but you might still have some weak cards to build upon and some strong cards to follow up with so that you can refill your board and utilize those resources in hand to reload and accomplish more instead of just running all out. Similarly, sometimes you just don't need to play minions all the time. Sometimes just hitting that hero power button does enough in this deck. I think too many people will just completely unload their hand, vomit every card they have onto the board. The opponent has the Flame Strike, they have the Volcanic Potion, the Brawl, whatever it might be, and then you're just out of gas and you end up hitting that hero power button anyway. So finding balance and understanding when to use the free resources available to you, like your hero power, is really important because remember, this deck has so many ways to utilize even just the hero power totems with those Flametongues, with those Bloodlusts, even with Evolves, that it's not a bad minion. It's often worth the 2 mana you're paying. It's not causing you a deficit like often hero powering would in a matchup. It's actually still just a really valuable play. So don't be scared to hit that button because you do need to balance your cards as a resource and your hero power as a resource as well. I know it's really easy to think about this as sort of an all-in, just hit the face style deck sometimes because you're loading up the board and you're hitting Bloodlust and you're seeing that rage in your minion's eyes and those numbers are growing and you want to kill people. But it does take a little bit of balance and a little bit of reservation in your play to actually make this deck work perfectly. You can't just be all out. You have to be conservative sometimes to figure this one out and win those games that otherwise you might just lose. So all that said, those are my 5 tips to really help you master Evolve Token Shaman. I've been playing this deck a lot. It's, of course, very powerful. It's one of the Tier 1 decks, this expansion, clearly. But so many people aren't winning enough games with it because they're missing some of these key aspects of getting the deck right and really making it shine. So I'm sure you guys have some tips of your own because I know I'm not the only person out there playing Evolve Shaman. So if you've got some Evolve Token Shaman ideas, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are, whether that's specific mulligans or matchup advice or tech cards, whatever it might be, share them in the comments below. I'll enjoy them. I'm sure my community will learn something as well, so it'd be greatly appreciated any insights you guys might have. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.